Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 5th of October in the 40th week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion on the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are David Green and David Johnson. We'll take turns suggesting an item from the week's news that's been ignored or misreported, maybe even innocently, and then giving the others a chance to comment on it. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is October 5th. On this day in 1986, Israel's secret nuclear weapons were revealed. The British newspaper The Sunday Times ran Mordecai Vannunu's story on its front page under the headline, "Revealed the Secret of Israel's Nuclear Arsenal." Mordecai Vanunu, no one knew that Israel had a nuclear arsenal until that point, 26 years ago, and they had developed it secretly, it is said. The United States complained that it knew nothing about it. Nobody really believes that, but there it is. Mordecai Vanunu, the man who revealed it, was an Israeli nuclear technician who, citing his opposition to weapons of mass destruction, revealed details of Israel's weapons program to the British press. He was subsequently lured to Italy by the Mossad, the Institute, the Israeli Secret Service, where he was drugged and abducted to Israel for trial. He was convicted in a secret trial and spent 18 years in prison, including more than 11 in solitary confinement. He was released from prison in 2004, but then became subject to a broad range of restrictions on his speech and movement. He's been arrested several times for violations of those restrictions, including talking to foreign journalists and attempting to leave Israel. In 2007, Vanunu was sentenced to 6 months in prison for violating terms of his parole. The sentence was considered unusual even by the prosecution, who expected a suspended sentence. In response, Amnesty International issued a press release on 2 July 2007 stating, quote, "The organization considers Mordecai Vanunu to be a prisoner of conscience and calls for his immediate and unconditional release," close quote. In May 2010, Vanunu was arrested and sentenced to 3 months in jail on suspicion that he met foreigners in violation of the conditions of his 2004 release from jail. He's been characterized internationally as a whistleblower, and he may remind you of someone more recently in the news. Israel, of course, considers him a traitor, and in fact, they've allowed him to live, which many American legislatures said shouldn't be, a privilege shouldn't be accorded to Julian Assange. Daniel Ellsberg has referred to Vanunu as, quote, "the preeminent hero of the nuclear era." In 2010, the British artist Richard Hamilton completed a painting based on the famous press photograph of Vanunu in transit after his abduction, with the information concerning his capture and release scrawled in his hand and pressed against the window of the vehicle that was carrying him away. And it's a striking painting, an artistic commemoration of this event, which otherwise has gone down the memory hole. Noam Chomsky himself says you can't take a poll on Vanunu in the United States, at least. He says, I don't think one person out of a million has ever heard of him. But among people that have ever heard of him, there's just total outrage. And once again, the parallel with the Assange case can hardly be ignored. Chomsky called Israel's sanctions against Vanunu, quote, "a scandal from the first moment," and said that the continuing moves to punish him for revealing what we all should know are just another black mark added to an ugly record of vengeance. Israel is one of 4 non-parties to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty known or believed to have nuclear weapons, but the only one not to have formally acknowledged possession of those. Although Israeli politicians and others have referenced them by implication or accident, most recently in the Roadrunner cartoon that Bibi Netanyahu had at the UN. But the point here, and that's never been quite clear, that the United States can, and never been quite clear to Americans, I think, that the United States can't admit that Israel has nuclear weapons because they were developed outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and American law calls for the cutting off of American aid or support for any country that develops nuclear weapons outside the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So that's one of the reasons that it was so important that what Vanunu released was released, and why Israel was so intent upon suppressing it and not admitting to this day that it has, what the world knows, is in fact hundreds of high-tech nuclear weapons. So, on this day in 1986, the world did find that out thanks to a whistleblower. But we know how we regard whistleblowers in the United States these days, right? You're watching News from Neptune, the Double David edition, David Johnson and David Green. And we'll start with David Green.
Thank you. I'm honored to have this program named after both of us. I want to mention in passing, in response to what Carl just said, I saw a reference recently to the fact that claiming that Israel had developed nuclear weapons with the help of Britain and France. That may be true in some technical level, but what I have been aware of, is that the most active collaboration in developing nuclear weapons that Israel participated in was with apartheid South Africa, going back to the 1960s, and there's pretty elaborate research on that, and they collaborated in many other ways all the way until the 1980s in terms of military weapons trade and the provision of Israel to weapons as South Africa supported the invasion of its various neighbors in the early 1980s, including Angola and Mozambique.
That's a vast story that really should be known once again, and is not known, including the role of Cuba in that exercise while the cooperation between South Africa and Israel was going on.
And it's that early 80s phase during the Reagan era that Chomsky refers to as the first war on terrorism, an aspect of what Chomsky refers to as the first war on terrorism back in the 1980s, which he reminds us was forgotten, when what was really the second war was declared in 2001. I want to mention Chomsky in relation to a talk I heard of his recently. The talk was probably a few years old. He was talking about foreign policy, and I thought sort of uncharacteristically referred to a certain level of lunacy or insanity in American foreign policy. He doesn't usually do that. Mm-hmm. He usually ascribes a certain amount of rationality in goals, especially in economic goals, especially when discussing American foreign policy after World War II and all the things that we tend to often refer to on this program, the wise men and the grand area strategy that came out of World War II and the various efforts along with the establishment of the CIA to exert American influence after World War II in a way that it hadn't been quite before. What Chomsky was referring to in particular was China. He referred to a book called Washington's China by a fellow named James Peck, who had gone into the National Security Archives, or the National Security Council archives, and looked at all the documents that we commonly also refer to on this show, or that Chomsky refers to, NSC 68 and so forth, written by people like George Kennan, one of the wise men. And the reason why Chomsky refers to this sort of lunacy and the manner in which he emphasized this had to do with the fact that whatever the rationality was, what these planners and these thinkers had to be doing was denying certain fundamental realities in order to affect this policy. So I guess I would like to try to explore this dichotomy between reasoned action, however motivated by capitalism and profits and greed and power and control and violence, versus the kind of dogmatic and denial aspects of that. In relation to China and what Chomsky was referring to, and what Peck wrote this book about, Washington, China, was in particular the inability, the unwillingness, or the perhaps impossibility of these people, Dean Acheson, George Kennan, John Foster Dulles, all of the people that we associate with the guiding lights of post-World War II foreign policy, to acknowledge that China was a force in and of itself, from the defeat of the nationalist Chinese in 1949 by the forces of Mao Zedong, all the way to Nixon's visit, at least to Nixon's visit to China in 1972. You have a series of sort of changing rationalizations as to what China was really up to. What Peck talks about first is that China was seen as the Soviet Union's puppet. In the context of the height of the Cold War in the early 1950s, China was seen as the Soviet Union's puppet. Later on, when it could no longer be argued that they were literally their puppet, they were seen as a kind of a junior partner. And when that could no longer be denied, especially after the clear break of China with the Soviet Union in 1964, China itself had to be seen as a sort of partner to this global revolutionary force. And so there was an unwillingness to recognize that China, obviously a large, historically rooted power in that part of the world, could be thought of in relatively normal, mundane terms as having both its own internal and regional interests and policies, whether related, that couldn't always be reduced to communism or their territorial ambitions. And so I come back to the concern, to the sort of question I would raise as to how it is that part of this rational and advantageous to elites in this country foreign policy that Chomsky always refers to also hinges on a very irrational and kind of lunatic denial of what is clear even to people of that time. And it was up to people like George Kennan, who on the one hand kind of knew what was going on, but on the other hand had to place everything in this Cold War ideological context. And I would relate that to what's going on in the current time in two ways. I'm reading just, at random almost, and there happens to be an election coming up in Venezuela, in which, as a part of which Hugo Chavez is, of course, being lambasted on the front page of the New York Times for inspiring fear among voters. There's literally, with no evidence whatsoever offered, no clear any kind of evidence that would pass the laugh test, but it still has to be argued that Chavez is this threatening, intimidating quasi-dictator of this country who has to be demonized in this way. And obviously, Iran, whatever the reality that is clear, whatever information we have about what's going on there in regard to their nuclear program, and whatever their efforts are to accommodate the United Nations and the international weapons agencies and so forth, they still have to be demonized in this way that is both rational in terms of the foreign policy goals of this country, but irrational and sort of borderline lunatic in its denial of what can clearly be seen.
Thank you, David. Take on this, David?
Well, I mean, I was very amused about Netanyahu's presentation of the United Nations. I mean, shocked, to be quite honest. I didn't call it, I immediately thought of Rocky and Bullwinkle.
Yep.
As opposed to Bugs Bunny with his
Sure.
little
They
cartoon
designed the
depiction
bomb.
of the bomb. I mean, unbelievable. But anyway, what David's referring to here is going to be actually kind of laid out in a three-part series I'm going to be airing on Labor's Worldview TV starting Sunday. It's called The Power Principle, and it's basically the history of the foreign policy of the United States governments since the end of the Second World War, as well as propaganda techniques they've used over the years to manipulate the American public. One interesting aspect about that propaganda that they've used over the years is a phenomenon called blowback. Now, I've always thought of blowback was something along the lines of that, you know, the United States, you know, messes with the internal affairs of another country, and then they anger people, and then these people retaliate. Well, what they refer to, another aspect, I guess, of blowback, is that when their propaganda becomes so pervasive that even over time, even the actors who are carrying out the foreign policy of the United States start to believe the lies themselves. The phenomena is not so much of the original creators of it, but more like the second and third generation of the people, say in the CIA or whatever, that have been hearing this all through, you know, their lives and during their training and everything else. So that's kind of what I wanted to mention. I mean, it's really interesting too if you look a little bit at the history of U.S. foreign policy. Some of the foreign policy disasters, I mean, that obviously come from, as David so adequately described, as sort of out of touch with reality, in dogma and everything else. I mean, some examples would be the creation of Al Qaeda by the CIA during the 1980s in Afghanistan and Pakistan to fight originally to destabilize the populist, democratically elected leftist government in Afghanistan, then later fight in the Soviet Union. And also you look at Manuel Noriega, the dictator that came to power in Panama after Omar Torrijos, who was a very populist leader, president in Panama, was mysteriously blown up in an airplane, a helicopter, which later John Perkins in his novel Confessions of an Economic Hitman stated it was done by the CIA. Look what happened there. I mean, another Frankenstein monster created along with Al Qaeda. And then let's not forget Saddam Hussein was a CIA asset going back to the 1960s when he's actually a contract assassin throughout the Middle East. And then, of course, later on was helped into power through the Ba'ath Party to depose a democratically elected government in Iraq. And then, of course, later on when you know, they were involved in the war with Iran. The classic scene of Donald Rumsfeld shaking Saddam Hussein's hand and providing him with all sorts of chemical weapons. So yeah, that's you know, it's quite interesting. You know, how a lot of people sit back and say, how in the heck did these disasters come about? Well, I mean, I think this is you know, an interesting phenomena that it just shows that when people like this are controlling foreign policy without transparency, without accountability, that these sort of things naturally occur, especially when the motives are not to serve the interests of the American people, but instead the 1% profits.
I think one of the important distinctions that we have to make here as we try to understand American policy, American history, American foreign policy in history, is a distinction between the actual motives of American leaders, of American policymakers, what they actually are planning to do, what they are setting up as they go along, and what they're saying to the American people. Now, these things can be pretty far apart. The classic case of the attempt to rearm the United States after the end of the Second World War, when there was vast resistance in the United States to it, and Senator Arthur Vandenberg, a leading Republican, told Harry Truman the only way for him to do it was to scare hell out of the American people. That's the usual purpose of what the U.S. government says about its foreign policy, to scare hell out of the American people. It doesn't matter whether it has anything much to do with the facts. It's nice if it occasionally does, but it doesn't often. In order to get that sort of acquiescence from the American populace to the policy that is being decided upon and run for the purposes of the 1%. you got a problem there. The biggest enemy of the American ruling class, or the American 1%, is, of course, the American populace, because they're the only ones who really can put a severe dent in the sorts of decisions that are being made by America's dominant social group, that 1%. Okay, so they got a problem there. One problem is to figure out what's going on in the world and what they want to do. The second problem is how to come up with a cover story that will get the American public on their side. And now the example that David mentioned seems to me to be a particularly good one, and a source for understanding this situation, basically American-Chinese relations, is one of the great historians of the American 20th century, William Appleman Williams, who in a book that should be much more read than it is, The Tragedy of American Diplomacy, described against this propaganda account, which, by the way, was pervasive within the American historical profession at the time. He said, look, if we look at what the U.S. was doing in the 20th century, it was trying to ensure control of China. Go back to the open door policy of 1899, where the U.S. arrived a little late at the party. The French and the British and the Russians and others were already dividing up bits of the declining Qing Empire in China, and wasn't sure the Americans were going to get a piece of the action. So America suddenly decided, hey, we should have an open door into China. Everybody who gets in, mainly us, should be able to get in, not just the Western imperial powers who've been there all along. Now, that policy, in a sense, is remarkably consistent throughout the 20th century. Indeed, you can say that it was that policy that led to the war in the Pacific, to the Second World War in the Pacific. The conflict with Japan didn't begin on the morning of December 7th, 1941. The conflict with Japan was a conflict over China, over who indeed would be able to control China. It was an imperial conflict that went back 2 generations before Pearl Harbor, indeed more than that, but it had been intense for those 2 generations, as the American government, the American policymakers recognized perfectly well. I might say parenthetically here that in observance of the passing of Gore Vidal, I've gone back to reread some of Vidal's stuff that I'd read years ago, and must admit I find it, interestingly different. You can never, not only can you never step in the same river twice, you can never read the same book twice, right? It turns out to be different in interesting ways, but very important. I refer particularly to his book, The Golden Age, which is about America basically during and after the Second World War. And it would seem to me that you could do few things that would help the understanding of the average high school student of what America was doing in the 20th century than giving them this novel to read. And one of the things it's about, of course, is the conflict over China. So when David refers to the sort of insanity that Chomsky rarely refers to, but apparently was at this point, I think one of the explanations of it, it's the conflict between the cover story, the propaganda that the U.S. government puts out, and what the U.S. government really is doing, consciously and consistently. This notion that American foreign policy just goes in a flibberty-gibbet fashion from one enthusiasm to another is absolutely false. There's a remarkable continuity in it, but the contradiction or the distinction is between what's actually being done by the American government and the cover story it has to give to the American people. Breaking that down would seem to me to be the most important thing that programs like ours could do. Would you agree, David?
Well, yeah, but I mean, the question arises, in discussing this business of what they really believe and what they really do, as to whether, as David refers to, I never really heard that that interpretation of blowback before. When people start to actually believe what only the rest of us are supposed to believe, whether there's a certain recklessness that goes along with that and a danger that goes along with that. And so to bring up Netanyahu in that context, who is arguably a product of the fact that we have certain policy goals in that part of the world, and that has that has contributed to a certain radicalization of politics within Israel itself, and the ascendancy of characters like Ariel Sharon and Netanyahu on the scene, sort of semi-permanently on the scene in Israel. And so I think when people say focus on that, they talk about a certain danger, a certain lunatic factor, because then you've got factions with Israel, the settlement faction, the Orthodox faction, who really do begin to drive policy because of their political power. And the question, so back to the basic question, is whether these things start to be believed and there are actual consequences and there are dangers that, on the one hand, people sitting in Washington now may have no real intention of ever attacking Iran or ever supporting Israel in doing so. But the question is it in their control now as to whether Israel, perhaps with the support of the lobby in this country, could do such a thing, thinking that the reality has shifted far enough that the American administration will have to sort of accede to that.
That's a very good point, and it's the one that, that Chomsky makes frequently, that he says if you actually look at what happened in Germany in the 30s, you can see that the Nazi Party was sponsored by the industrialists and by what we would call today the 1% in German society, but who thought that they could control them. But what happened was, in fact, the party got out of the control of that 1% and produced the horrors that we're familiar with from that era. So, yeah, insanity is always a threat, eh?
Dangerous.
Yes, it's dangerous. Bad craziness is the way
Carl, I just cannot see Israel going it alone attacking Iran. I mean, Iran's no Iraq. I mean,
think you're right about that.
I think what they're trying to do is like you were mentioning, prod the United States into doing it. Of course, at our taxpayer expense and our risk. But I think like any other group, I think there's divisions within the ruling class.
Sure.
Both in the United States and abroad, and I think there's a real hesitation, despite maybe some occasional rhetoric, that this could be very destabilizing for world profits. And
I'm sure you're right.
Let's not forget, despite certain things like David pointed out, certain lunatic, fringe, fanatical interests, whether it be the Christian right or, in the case of Israel, the settler. Orthodox settlers, it pretty much comes down to money. I mean, that's more or less what most motivations are amongst the 1%, both here and abroad.
Quoting the apostle, perhaps at this point, David. Yes, I think there's a great deal to this. I was reminded in the earlier discussion of the remark attributed to Karl Kraus in the early 20th century. He says political problems occur because politicians lie to reporters and then believe what they read in the newspapers. So, maybe that's the sort of infection that David is talking about here. You are watching News from Neptune, and we will turn now to our second David of the day, David Johnson, with some comments on what he's been reading and thinking this week.
Well, did everybody get a chance to see the presidential debates?
Was there a debate?
That's a good question. In fact, Carl, you're not alone in that. It's amazing. Some of the people I've been talking to out there, just regular working people, have been saying kind of the same thing. My wife had a similar experience in her workplace amongst people. One secretary asked my wife, I'm usually pretty apolitical, but I did watch the debates, and maybe I'm missing something, but they seemed like both candidates seemed like they were talking in circles and not really talking any specifics at all. And there didn't really seem to be a whole lot of difference between the two of them. And of course, my wife just smiled and nodded her head. But it's amazing. Carl, you didn't happen to see the News Gazette headline on Thursday, the day after the debate?
I did. The banner headline.
The banner, huge banner headline. a clear divide.
Yeah.
Well, I say nothing could be farther from the truth. I mean, there's about a dime's worth of difference, if even that, between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney.
Right.
I mean, they're both have the same agenda, and I think it came out, on Wednesday night. I don't know if many people got a chance to either go on the internet, or those who have satellite television could access free speech television or station or Link TV station where they had the extended debates.
Yes.
Basically sponsored by Democracy Now!, in which they broadcast live the Obama-Romney debate and then paused and let Jill Stein of the Green Party and Rocky Anderson of the Justice Party, who are also running for president, but who were denied access to the debates, a chance to respond as well. I'll tell you, I wish all the American people could have seen this, because it was like night and day between these two candidates compared to the two corporate candidates, Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. I mean, they talked specifics. They went into actual facts, disputing what both Romney and Obama had to say. And it was real interesting. The other interesting thing was, it seemed like Mitt Romney was coached and practiced all week and came very well prepared, and Barack Obama didn't take him very seriously, considering all his blunders in the media in the past, and didn't prepare.
Yeah, there's been various speculations about that. But I look, your analysis, David, is the most positive one I've heard in the sense that people are saying, hey, these two guys are speaking for positions that they say are different, but they're the same. Now, if people actually did take that away from the debate, then it was a wonderful success, it seems to me.
Well, it's really interesting. One woman that my wife in the workplace where she's at said that she's always considered herself a conservative, but she said that she didn't consider Mitt Romney a conservative at all. And what I think she was referring to a traditional conservative, not a right-wing neocon or a right-wing fanatical crazy, but more of real traditional conservative values, as opposed to those that have been sort of in place today, that the label conservative actually put on people of the likes like Mitt Romney and many of the other Republicans in national office. But it's really interesting, because it seems like, well, I guess the point I want to make here is this went across the board. Previously, too, there was other people in the school who were really big fans of Barack Obama, came out and mentioned the day after the debate that they were just extremely disappointed, that they thought that Barack Obama wasn't talking real issues that affected their lives.
Well, as I say, if that gets about, we'll all be the better for it.
Like the Emperor's new clothes, Carl.
Yeah,
I think maybe the people are starting to see that the Emperor is actually nude and not wearing any clothes. And I mean by Emperor, not Barack Obama, but the U.S. ruling class in this facade of a choice. How many times have we heard the word choice used in any given speech by Barack Obama? I mean, I know one, it was a 5-minute, if even that, soundbite where I counted it 11 times. I think they're really performing a contortion act here to try to make the American public think that they still really have a choice in this country.
I like the notion that the only thing thoroughly dressed the other night in the debate was Mitt Romney's hair. We have a communication from a friend of this ground, Dr. No, who used to produce the program when it was on radio, sends the following note. He says, I watched only the Democracy Now! Debate with Green and Justice Party candidates, the one you referred to, inserted in. My main reaction was this. Jill Stein, that's the Green Party candidate, Jill Stein did almost nothing to indicate what she'd do as president. I don't mind some critique of Obama, but for an election, I like to know why I should vote for someone, not just why I shouldn't vote for someone. You think, well, let me finish this. I'd like to know whether you thought that Stein did make that mistake. Neither Stein nor Anderson did much to separate the Greens and Justice portions on the issues, that is, between those two parties. But the more serious critique, I think, is the notion that in addition to criticism of Obama, the common Obama-Romney position, Stein should have put out a positive program, which she has. The so-called Green New Deal has been kicking around for a while. These are positive proposals, but apparently she didn't articulate this the other night. Dr. No goes on to point out that Anderson is not on the ballot in our county, and Stein is, and that's true in the state of Massachusetts. In the state of Illinois too. Actually, it is true in the state of Massachusetts. He concludes, I won't catch the other debates. I'll wait for someone else to tell me if they get around to pointing out what a killer Obama is or how our civil liberties are dwindling under Obama. So it certainly was worthwhile that Democracy Now! Did what it did. But was it the fact, did you have the feeling that Stein skimped on her positive program?
I think, Carl, let me just state in general, I think Rocky Anderson did a much better job of communicating than Jill Stein. I don't think it was so much, they agreed totally on the issues. I mean, there was no difference really between them. But I think a lot of it had to do with the format, because now remember, they were pausing after the Obama and Romney questions, and then they were basically responding. So they were kind of hemmed in a little bit by the format. However, I didn't remember hearing Jill Stein state this Green New Deal at least 2 or 3 times. Now, she didn't go into any specifics, but again, I think that was partly limited by the format. And I think because of that, they were kind of more or less forced to go into criticisms of the 2 candidates. However, they did, in Jill Stein's behalf, I will say that she pointed out Jeffrey Sachs' wonderful study that came out about 6 months ago about both the Romney-Ryan proposed budget if they were elected president and Barack Obama's proposed budget if he's reelected, dealing with cuts to Medicare and Social Security. Well, what's interesting is they're identical.
Yeah.
I'll say that again. They're identical within maybe a percentage point as far as the percentage of gross domestic product that is going to be cut from the both Medicare and Social Security budgets.
One of the Obama people's biggest criticism of their guy was that he admitted that in the midst of the on Social Security, right? That their approach to Social Security was essentially the same. David, did you see the augmented debate by any chance?
I didn't see. Well, I read the transcript of it and I saw a little bit of clips about it the following morning, and then but didn't see the debate itself. That was a joint decision that my wife and I made. We were either of us was willing to accede to the other if we wanted to watch it, but neither of us was willing to push the ball forward. So
I watched the Yankees and the Red Sox myself. So
yeah, well, I have been watching a little more baseball, but I didn't happen to on that particular night. But I guess I would only say, only half seriously perhaps, that Romney's life has been one of double dealing in various ways and convincing. I mean, certainly both candidates must be able to convince themselves that they must be able to convince their audience that they believe things that they don't. But I think that Romney actually probably believes more, may have done better because he's more convinced, however many times he changes his mind, however much he backtracks and appeases, or if that's the right word, panders to different elements of the Republican Party and now the broader electorate, he convinces himself that what he's saying is true. I mean, I think there's a kind of pathology about that, and Obama shares that, except that being a Democrat and having to pander to a more liberal base, he might be a little less adept at actually, and perhaps having a clue that what he's saying really isn't believed by a lot of the people that try to support him or claim to support him. Perhaps he's a little bit more uncomfortable and a little bit more in conflict, and the result of this was this alleged sort of apathy that he projected. He just isn't into it somehow.
If our colleague Ron Zook were here, he would at this point jump up and say, "You can't speculate on the motives of the people." What they,
no, well, it is speculation, and it's not of much import.
Usually, he's criticizing when he says that, but still,
it's not of much import either, because this isn't a sport. Speaking of sporting contests, as much as the media treats this as a sporting contest, when you have a baseball game, a team wins or loses, it goes on their record, and it matters in that context. There's nothing about this debate ultimately that really matters in the context of this election, I can't imagine that the result of this really is going to be to sway very many voters and to change the outcome. Obviously Romney's trying to spin that this has created a new dynamic. I doubt that that's true.
I think what's trying to be done here is to try to get the American people to vote so that they feel better about the system that we have. I mean, it's interesting. We have the lowest voter participation rate in the industrialized world. Is there any wonder why that is? I mean, considering the history of the past 30 years in particular, I mean, it's just that, you vote. I mean, look, everyone was so excited when Bill Clinton got elected in 1992. Oh, a relief. It was like the Allies had just liberated Paris, right? And from 12 years of, Ronald Reagan and George Bush the First, and I mean, it wasn't even within a year. Clinton was not only continuing the Reagan agenda, but expanding it with the passage of the North American Free Trade Agreement, which cost millions of good-paying, primarily union jobs in this country that went to China, and continued to promote free trade treaties, the WTO treaty, GATT, and then went on to eliminate the Glass-Steagall Act, which basically was the root of the cause of our financial meltdown in 2008. That was the law that was passed during the Great Depression to separate commercial banking and speculative banking interests, and also laid the groundwork for the Patriot Act by doing some real damage to the habeas corpus rights on the federal level. So, it's no wonder that there was such a problem as far as Al Gore having any credibility. I mean, you think about it. Back in the election of 2000, after 2 terms of Clinton, you had a choice between a dingbat that basically got into Harvard Law School with a D average. Well, how does people do that? Well, if your father and grandfather are on the board of the Board of Regents and have donated large sums of money to school, well, where there's a will, there's a way. But anyway, you had a choice between a borderline mental retard and a guy that was so boring. I think I can't imagine how this anyone would be happy to vote with him. In fact, I think Al Gore might be the first sitting vice president in history that lost his own state when he ran for president. That's Tennessee. That's an actual fact. But what I thought was interesting is Mitt Romney came across like a used car salesman. I mean, very slick, and Barack Obama, I think, David, you might have, I mean, let's put it this way. Barack Obama is a shameless opportunist. I mean, if you know anything about his history, it's no wonder. However, I mean, I think there is a certain little bit of a problem there, because this was the guy that was running on hope and change, and real quick, hope went to cope. So I think that's, I think that might be an accurate phenomena there.
There's another aspect of this that the 2 elections that you mentioned, 1992 and 2000, seem to point out, I think, Dave, and that is that we forget rather quickly the issues in the elections that actually did sway people, because the policies followed by the new administration turn out, as you say, to be continuous and consistent with the one that went before. Now, let me give you an example of that. In the election of 2000, George Bush, the younger, the lesser, ran as a critic of the nation building and the foreign wars that the Clinton people had got us involved into. That is, this specifically was the war against Serbia, the attack on Serbia, the Kosovo War, as it's sometimes called. But remember, Bill Clinton had also managed to fire cruise missiles into Afghanistan and Iraq, and was generally behaving as other American presidents have in terms of defending the empire, and particularly the control of Middle East energy resources. There's no difference about it at all. But Bush had to run against that, had to criticize that, precisely because there was enough dismay in the country about it. Now, if you go back and listen to the speeches of the 2000 campaign, not knowing that 9/11 was out there in the future, what you have here is one candidate arguing against nation building in foreign countries, arguing against military adventures and so forth, and the other defending what the current administration, what the Clinton administration had just done. Which are you going to vote for? Well, a lot of people look at that and say, yeah, I want to vote against that. I want to vote against this sort of this warmongering of the Clinton administration. We've seen other examples of that. In 1992, for example, it was precisely the elder Bush's administration's restraints on Israel that attracted a lot of votes. The Clinton people came in, and the constraints went away. Now, once again, if we want to talk about the motives for the constraints amongst the first Bush administration, we might not get very far. The particular views of particular members of that administration are not too important. But in terms of what people vote for and how they're hoodwinked, it seems to me that there's quite a track record of American elections that should be attended to. To take one final example, in 2006, and I won't even mention in 2008 people who voted for the peace candidate and what they got, but in 2006 the Democrats were given control of Congress as they recognized at the time specifically to bring the Mideast wars to an end. Leading Democrats said that, recognized it, that's what they're, and then we found them spend the next 4 years, 2 years of that Congress, undercutting that. They never intended to. Of course they didn't. But they had to say that in order to get elected in 2006 because that's what Americans wanted. Now, when we got this level of duplicity going on in these campaigns, we really do need to begin to take apart the propaganda from all sides and the actual goals, the actual policies that are being by these lies, insulated from politics, insulated from what Americans really want on this matter. It's a major art. I mean, in fact, one might say it's the leading American art, how to lie to the people for fun and profit. And, we're best.
Let me say this about John F. Kennedy in 1960.
Yeah, okay.
He ran to the right of Nixon and Eisenhower in foreign policy.
Exactly.
And darn it, he did it. So that's the exception, if you want to call it.
Wait. Oh, he ran to the right, and he did, and he indeed put a.
Was more of a Cold Warrior, or as much of a Cold Warrior.
By damn, at least he was an honest imperialist.
He was an honest imperialist.
Yeah.
Whereas in '64, Johnson purported to run to the left of Goldwater, but continued the war in Vietnam.
Yep.
And in '68, Nixon ran to the left of Johnson or of
absolutely.
Humphrey,
yes,
and
yes.
continued the war in Vietnam.
This is all true.
So it always holds the exception, the sort of trivial exception of Kennedy proves the rule, I guess.
Look at that exception for a moment, though, and how it was done. Kennedy, in the larger sense, told the truth by running to the right of the Eisenhower administration. Let's get this country moving again, as he said. And Kennedy's inaugural address in 1961, in January of 1961, is probably the most fascist speech given by an American leader since the Second World War. Ask not what you can do for your country, but what your country can do for you. That's what he should have said. But remember, this was the election that was based finally on the most egregious lie, the most obvious lie of practically any of these campaigns. He was following Arthur Vandenberg's advice by the missile gap. That campaign, the Kennedy campaign, was we've got to get this country moving again because there is a great missile gap between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They've got all these missiles and we don't have enough, so we got to get more, otherwise they'll nuke us. And I mean, it was a flat-out lie, and there's no question that they knew it was a flat-out lie. There was no missile gap. The Soviet Union did not have missiles that the U.S. Didn't have in quantity, and that was the whole point of the campaign. So, hey, you gotta, you figure that. Here's the point. We know they're lying. The point is to figure out how they're lying and what they really intend to do,
and also what to do about it. I mean, it seems like what's happening is a lot of people out there in the American electorate have just given up and have quit voting.
Yes.
Or, I mean, they won't vote for any of the above. I mean, either that they just leave that particular race blank, or they'll vote for a third-party candidate. Of course, Carl, as we all know, what happened in 2000, a lot of people voted for Ralph Nader and the Green Party because they were sick and tired of the duplicity of the Clinton administration, which Al Gore was right there in the probably he was actually the pit bull, if you will, of Bill Clinton. And the alternative George W. Bush. And then, of course, after the election, it always just angers me how people are saying, you voted for Nader, look what you did. Well, you know, I have to quote a famous quote from a labor leader that's actually from Terre Haute, Indiana, about 70 miles from here, Eugene Debs, who was the president of the American Railroad Workers Union. He said, I'd rather vote for something that I want and not get it than to vote for something I don't want and end up getting it anyway. Of course, Eugene Debs ran for president a couple occasions. And of course, people are always saying, well, you can't vote for a third-party candidate because they won't win. Well, okay, that's been the case so far, but what's our alternative, people? We keep going. Are we going to keep doing this exercise in futility, or as Albert Einstein said, to repeat an experiment over and over again and expect different results is one definition of insanity. We can't carry on like this. We have to start building an alternative party to the Democrats and Republicans, or take back control of one or both of the political parties. I advocate both. I believe in a sort of a push-me-pull-you strategy, sort of hedging our bets, to put it another way. But this has got to change. I mean, because there's too much at stake here. I mean, especially for younger workers. I mean, if we don't change this trajectory, younger workers are going to be working for less wages. They're going to be working longer hours, and if they're lucky, they're going to end up getting some pension, but it's not going to be worth a crap. They're not going to be able to live on it, and it's probably going to be privatized. If you remember correctly, Carl, after the brutal military coup in Chile, they privatized the whole economy, including Social Security, and within a matter of, I think it was 5 or 6 years, the fund went broke. It went belly up. All these people were left with nothing. Now, what's interesting, though, is the military, they kept the Social Security system, and they did just fine.
Once I charged you with optimism at the top of the hour here, David. I think you've done it again. I really do. Your optimism that there is an electoral solution, or as you would say in other systems which have a language for this, a parliamentary solution to these problems, that we can, as you say, take over one of the parties or change the parties and so forth. I mean, you know, I hope you're right, but I suggest that once again you're being optimistic, and a pessimist like me looks at this and says there isn't an electoral solution, there isn't a parliamentary solution. The only way the economic and military policies of this and the previous administration, because they're the same, are going to be changed is by a movement like the Civil Rights Movement or the anti-Vietnam War movement or something of that sort, which, remember, developed outside of these electoral instruments and became electoral issues only once they'd succeeded, so to speak.
Carl, I absolutely agree with you. And as I've said several times before, as a carpenter by trade, I have many tools in my toolbox, and I'm not restricted. I try to take advantage of any tool I think can get the job done. We're right now in an election year, so I'm talking about that. But as far as just relying on a parliamentary solution, you're absolutely right. People think that just by voting is going to change anything. Oh, you're very much delusional. I shouldn't say that strong a word, but you're mistaken. It has to be. I'm not saying that elections can't be useful, but the thing is that mass mobilization of people, refusal to cooperate, occupations is what's going to have to happen, if for no other reason, to get organized and to bring these issues to the forefront, and then actually maybe start running candidates that are real representatives in local elections, but also participate in the national elections, if nothing else, to get the issues broadcast out there. That is, if we can get access to media, which is one of the big pillars of the control of the ruling class over us.
So, just for the sake of our argument, and given we're in the 13th district, in congressional district, I'm thinking in terms of, I agree with what you're saying. So, let's think in practical terms instead of, say, ideological terms, practical organizational terms, sort of programmatic terms. What are the best programs to organize around? Say, an obvious one would be universal health, Medicare for all, or socialized medicine, or whatever you want to call it. making it clear that neither of the established political parties or presidential candidates is for that, but we have a local candidate who has at least expressed a support for universal coverage, universal governmental coverage, as opposed to a more, so that's sort of working within, without. What does that really mean? What might the consequences of that really be? I don't know.
We're talking about David Gill and Rodney Davis in the 13th Congressional District here. Davis is a Republican Party hack, no better than he should be. Gill, I have personal differences with, in the sense that ever since he began running for Congress, I've asked him to say that he would vote against war the way our incumbent congressman does, who happens to be a Republican and very unusual in that regard. And David Gill has never quite been able to bring himself to do that. But he, as you suggest, he's quite clear on the point that the Affordable Care Act doesn't go far enough, and what we need is Medicare for all. That's so obvious that it shouldn't even be contentious. But it's remarkable only that we have a congressional candidate in this district who's saying that, and I'll vote for him on those grounds, certainly. There's a lot of other things that he should be talking about too, I think.
You know, it's interesting, Carl. I met his opponent, the Democratic opponent, the Democratic primary, at the farmers market here in Urbana, actually. And I was introduced to him, and I said, let me ask you this. What's your position on expanding Medicare? He goes, what? Excuse me? Expand Medicare? I said, you heard me. And that's exactly the tone I took, too. You heard me. And he said he was quiet. Next thing his wife says, honey, we have to go now. That's a true story. I can't remember his name. He was
Matt Gettin, was it?
No, it was the other one.
The other one.
Yeah, I can't remember his name.
Well, honeys, we got to go now. This has been News from Neptune for October 5th and the 40th week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been a Double David edition with David Johnson and David Green. And we should mention we add to our necrology this week another historian and quantum communist, Eric Hobsbawm, died this week at age 95. And I recommend particularly Terry Eagleton's assessment, which I will place on the News from Neptune Facebook page, which is taken over from our web page these days. Also this week, Barry Commoner, the pioneering environmental scientist and activist, died. He also was 95. So it was a bad week for people born in 1917, and that may lead to another reflection. If our program interested you, you might want to look for similar programs here at Urbana Public Television, which is now streaming online, by the way. Go to urbanapublictelevision.org and look for the live stream button. This evening at 10 p.m., a Democracy Now! Special, the third-party candidates that we've talked about here today, this evening, will be re-shown in full. Tomorrow at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., News from Neptune. At 3 p.m., the Populist Dialogues. Sunday, the 7th, at 7:30 a.m., the White House Chronicle. 3:30 p.m., the Populist Dialogue. At 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview with David Johnson. And David, say again what this particular... Oh, you get your microphone off. Okay. But, hey, don't miss Labor's Worldview tomorrow, Sunday afternoon at 4.
Something about foreign policy.
At 9:30 p.m., the Democracy Now! Special will be rerun. Weekdays, 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, 8 a.m., The Big Picture, and noon, The David Pakman Show. On Monday, Labor's Worldview will be repeated at 1 p.m. At 2 p.m., the Tom Hartman program, a live 3-hour call-in, and at 5 p.m., European Journal. Tuesday, the 9th, 7 p.m., European Journal, 7:30 p.m., Alternatives to Incarceration, a town hall forum held here. At 9:30 p.m., the White House Chronicle, and at 10 p.m., Aware on the Air, starring Ron Zoke. Now, I'm Carl Estabrook. This and other editions of the program can be seen on our website and on Facebook. Search for News from Neptune. I can be reached at Carl@News from Neptune and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. And indeed, if you'd like to, apply for an empty chair here, if there's ever an empty chair, let me know. We might see who else we can get to come talk to us. Our thanks to UPTV, especially Jake, Jason, Caleb. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune. To remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come and yours and mine discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.